Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, be starting soon. Okay, speech begins in three, two, one. Panel, in times of economic crisis, the number one thing that is needed is decisive action. You need to take action before the problem compounds upon itself. You need to take action before default turns into more default, before hunger turns into more deaths, before you reach the point of no return, before you reach the point where your country will never be able to rebuild itself. And we said that in order to achieve that decisive action, you need centralized authority, you need centralized power. Very proud to propose. I'm going to do three things in this speech: some setup. Actually, no, I'm going to do like two things in this speech. I'm going to do setup, and then I'm just going to give like one big argument on why autocracies are better at handling this than democracies, with a number of like kind of sub mechanisms and sub arguments. Okay, on setup, what does economic crisis look like? It looks like severe shocks to economic infrastructure that ends up negatively impacting the whole population. This could come in a variety of different forms. It could look like financial default shockwaves. It could look like supply chain disruptions that prevent necessary resources from arriving to the places that they need to arrive. It looks like severe inflation that could be caused by a variety of reasons. But the point is, we label these things as an economic crisis when they become so severe that they're affecting a lot of the population very negatively. That people can't put food on their table, that people don't have gas in their homes, that people lose their jobs, that businesses all around them are defaulting, and now they cannot actually live their life as normal or to any degree of a feasible quality of life. How do we measure quality of life then in this debate? We would firstly say that this house comes from like the average person's perspective within any given economic crisis. And therefore, in moments of economic crisis, we say that the most proximate and the most urgent concern for average people is utilitarian sustenance and economic recovery. The fact that during an economic crisis, you might care about a lot of things, but the first thing you probably care about is getting food back on your table and gas back in your home, a job back on your paycheck so you can actually put money in your wallet and provide for your family, etc. This is a very simple, like logical conclusion. You can look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you cannot fulfill like the very bare, basic security and physiological needs, then evolutionarily we cannot give much of a damn about anything else. Okay, what this means then is that you do not care if the government overextends its power or if it is undemocratic, because economic needs are far more urgent in that period of time. And we said that even if they are undemocratic about this, insofar as the action they are taking is towards economic stability, that's something you would have tacitly consented to anyways. Therefore, this debate should be centered on whether democracies or autocracies are superior at providing this economic stability during economic crises by merit of their system and how it is set up. All right, let's define democracy. We're broadly talking about representative democracy here. We think that in these democracies, there are so many like bureaucratic checks and balances for all sorts of decisions that need to be made. And also there's a much stronger degree of inalienable rights citizens hold that the government will need a lot of justification to breach. Autocracy, on the other hand, looks like a centralized power. It looks like decisions being made by a single person and their board of advisors. It looks like this power having a lot of capital and a lot of military power to be able to enforce whatever decisions they make. Okay, why are autocracies better at handling economic crises? Firstly, we need to look at each way an economic crisis must be addressed. One, the mobilization of resources. In the instance where productivity is severely compromised, either through business failure, ceasing of imports, etc., resources therefore become scarce and must be rationed carefully, because these resources are necessary for the functioning of the economy to continue. Not only because you need food on people's table for them to actually be like well fed and to stay alive and to have the energetic means to continue working, but also because you need certain key resources to be rationed carefully across the most important sectors. So if you have a limited amount of oil because an oil embargo is on you, you need to be extremely careful about where you're allocating that oil. You need to allocate it specifically to places that are going to need it the most, that are the most dire, the most necessary, like the industries that are actually relevant to sustaining life, and not like things like entertainment, whatever. And the problem here is that often these resources are not distributed efficiently or equally. but often they are stored in, really useless industries like entertainment, as I mentioned, or that a lot of the wealthy 1% of the population are holding an excess of resources for themselves. In order to sustain the population and make sure that people have the will and capacity to stay alive, let alone rebuild their country, everyone must get their hands on resources, and this requires redistributing them from the wealthy to the masses, from the unnecessary to the necessary. Autocracy enables this to happen because the government holds so much power in an autocracy. They have the paramilitary that is necessary to march up to some company and say, look, we deem you as a non-necessity. We are going to strip you of the oil that is your property and redistribute it elsewhere because that is the right thing to do in this instance. On democracy, on the other hand, presents way more barriers to this because of the rights citizens have the right citizens have claims to, for instance, their own property. The fact that you would probably be a lot less justified or have a lot less political will to be able to march into people's homes, take their money, and redistribute it elsewhere. This is probably going to lead to huge backlashes for you after the economic crisis. You're probably going to get jailed and sentenced, which means leaders have a disincentive to do this. Secondly, though, the facilitation of labor. Forcing certain spending and working habits is necessary to recover from an economic crisis, and also to make sure that the economy sustains itself in the interim. You need to make sure that the most vital sectors and businesses are still able to function. For that, you need employees to actually run the operations, to actually produce the things that are necessary to produce. But that's unavailable when businesses default and they cannot employ anyone. This is the situation where it is necessary to bail out these companies or simply force people to work these jobs to prop up the economy again. And yes, perhaps this labor comes with little to no pay and it is coercive, but it is at least conducive to economic recovery and immediate continued access to vital resources, which people care about a lot more. You're probably going to work anyways. You're going to struggle anyways. It is a lot better for you to struggle and have food on your table than not. An autocratic government also means you have the ability to bring those who are affluent enough not to work in times of economic crisis to help out and get all hands on deck anyways. Third reason, decisive action. Democracies take forever to pass bills. They have so many steps that you need to go through. There's opposing parties who create deadlocks, and even if they do pass bills, they're limited in ability for the reasons that I gave. You can't pass anything too extremist because then afterwards those will get repealed and then you will get sentenced. That is why there's a disincentive. But note, it is uncomparative and unengaging for opposition to use autocratic provisions within a democracy to win its debate, such as calling things like states of emergency. These methods literally mimic autocracies and how they function. That is just a cowardly path to victory to take. Okay, fourthly, why do autocrats have good incentives? Because one, they need the economic stability to preserve their power. They need economic stability to be able to fund their things like their military and to keep themselves safe from the pressure of Western forces and to not be beholden to their economic coercion. They also need the approval of their people in order to prevent things like mass protest. In the end, the weighing is very simple. If there is no action, you have guaranteed failure. If you try to do something decisive, you might have a chance at saving everyone. Very proud.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech. And now to open the case for side opposition, I call on the leader of the opposition. Here.
Perfect. I will take POIs in the chat, please. So I will start by taking the route that PM just called cowardly. So first of all, do note that emergency governments do exist, right? And I think that they're still limited to an extent. There are still certain limitations that PM was outlining. So it is in fact comparative. But I do think that it's important to note that it is a way of mitigating the issues that they were talking about in terms of efficiency and how quickly you can pass policies. But let's talk about two things in this debate, right? So first of all, incentives, second of all, capacity to pass good policies that are fixing the economy. So what I'm going to provide to you are two main arguments. So first of all, why we're able to achieve better economy with two sub-arguments, I guess. And then secondly, on how it plays out on the social level, so to speak, for an average citizen and why you are much less likely to get, for example, arrested in a democracy. Okay, cool. First of all, the economy. Let's talk about incentives, right? Because PM talks a lot about why, as an autocratic government, you probably have the capacity to do certain good things, why you have the ability to pass bills quickly, and so on. The problem is, in an autocracy, you're accountable to a far smaller group of people, but importantly, you're still accountable to them, right? So you're reliant, first of all, on the support of oligarchs, so people who also have a lot of money, a lot of power in your country, and who are potentially looking at you and waiting for you to fail to overthrow you. And then secondly, you're accountable to the army, which support you need to make sure that you can keep the citizens in check and remain in charge. So the issue here is that PM tells you, so you're going to take resources from, for example, 1% and redistribute it so that more people have access to them. The issue is you can't really do that, right? Because at the point at which you pass laws or like, well, do things, I guess you don't necessarily pass laws, that are not beneficial for the army or for people on whose support you rely to stay in charge, the oligarchs, right? At this point, you're risking that there will be coalitions created against you. You're risking that the army will no longer support you and actually rebel against you. You're risking that people who probably have been waiting for you to stumble, to create a coalition, to speak out openly against you and try to overthrow you will feel safe enough to do this now because they know that a lot of people who are important in the country are pissed off with you, right? So what this means is that as this sort of autocrat, you're essentially way too afraid to take any things that affect people whose support you rely on to a significant extent, because you know that this is literally potentially the end of you being in charge. On our side of the house, though, you're accountable to a much larger group of people. So you're accountable to all the citizens in the country. You presumably still want to remain in charge after this economic crisis is over. You want to be elected again. So what this means is that, first of all, you have literally the incentives to ensure that as many people as possible go through the crisis as smoothly as possible. But also, secondly, what this means is that you literally are not constrained by what I just explained, right? Like you're not accountable to a very small group of people who have the sole power to overthrow you. So what this means is that absent of that, you, even because of the simple impulse of, okay, I want to live in this country and I want it to be functional, you still can just reinvest the money into the economy in the ways that you believe are the best. But then secondly, in the chat, please, I asked for POIs in the chat. Secondly, let's talk about international support, right? Because I think that in a lot of cases, in economic crises, they are very difficult to overcome. And do note that the ones where you are able to deal with them internally and you're able to like just use the money in your country to sort of mitigate this, these are probably the less serious ones. The more serious ones are the ones where literally without support, your country is going to collapse. And we think that on our side of the house, you're far more likely to receive this international support. We think that IMF or like other bodies, for example, trade unions, are far more likely to lend you money when they know that you're a democracy, when they perceive you as a country that is reliable, that is bound by international laws and is going to pay the money back once it is able to, as opposed to when you're an autocracy, you probably do not comply by a lot of international laws. You're not perceived as a trustworthy country. So this means that other countries and bodies are going to be hesitant to give you loans because they're not sure if you're going to pay back. But then even if they give you loans, in a lot of cases, it might be conditional, for example, on, restructuring your country and so on, which means that, first of all, receiving this is slower because you have to, sign a lot of policies, create new treaties and so on. But secondly, this also means that in a lot of cases, you just might not really be willing to do this as an autocrat because this means that you're losing loads of power. So we think that on our side of the house, you get much easier access to loans that are able to help you boost your economy again and survive the economic crisis to ensure that the citizens are doing as well as possible, as quickly as possible. Okay, I will take POI from closing, please.
Oligarchs are profit-driven people who cares about the country's economy because they care about things like currency and so on and so forth. Why would they not have the incentive to ensure that
Sure. Okay, so I think that there are two things here, right? So first of all, I think that not a lot of them are necessarily perfect actors that are going to care about the well-being of country in general. I think that in a lot of cases, they will prioritize their own profit because they know that they can just move out of the country when they, for example, can no longer live here because it's no longer like a sustainable place to live. But then secondly, I think that even if you're right, to overthrow you, probably they're not necessarily looking for, in some cases, for a legitimate reason to do so, but they're just looking for an excuse, right? And you taking away privileges from this group is often a very good excuse. Cool, let's move on to social stuff. So in autocracy, essentially, you need to make sure that citizens are not going to rebel against you, because that encourages, or like protest, because that encourages other citizens to do the same. And then it's very difficult for you to stay in power and to ensure that, that you're able to run the country as you would like to. So what this means is that in times of economic crisis, as a citizen, you're far more likely to try to do protests or even try to do illegal things to make money and try to survive. But when you're in an autocracy, this is going to be punished in much more harsh way, because they need to make an example out of you and they're not bound by rules of human rights and so on, right? So this means that to sort of make a show of power, if you break the law, which is easier to do in times of strain and economic crisis, then you're going to suffer much more on their side of the house. For these reasons, oppose.
Wonderful. I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and now call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
All right, am I audible? Okay. I'll take POIs in chat, please. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. All right, the structure of my speech is very simple. I'm going to explain why LO is completely wrong and then why our arguments are still standing. So firstly, I would like to note that them assuming that their comparative is emergency mechanisms that exist within democracies is entirely contradictory, given their entire argument is about how we are against things like radical policies, or we are against autocracies engaging in these sort of things. We think the emergency mechanisms that they concede on their side of the house is a weak stance. It means that you're giving individuals more power inherently. We think it contradicts and concedes all of our arguments. I think our point on why democracies were incapable was far more legitimate in terms of explaining why there's going to be political deadlock when you have multiple political parties trying to criticize each other and prevent other administrations from being successful. That if you ever even pass the bill, that would eventually be deemed extremist and unconstitutional, which literally happened to Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression by the Supreme Court. These are the problems that we were talking about on their side of the house. What do they say in response? Firstly, they say democracies appeal to everyone, and this is why they're going to have things like redistribution programs. This is completely untrue. Political parties appeal to their base and rich donors because it means that they can gain political power from that. So look at the Republicans and how they appeal to big business. Republicans do not represent, everyone within a democracy. I think it's unfair to claim that democracies are simply going to allow like these mass redistribution programs to happen. The second thing they say is that we can get loans from other countries, right? And then other countries, because, they believe more in democracies instead of autocracies, this means that we're going to get money. Two problems with this. Firstly, I would note that there are other actors that are non-democratic and still have a lot of money, for example, like China, that are able to hand out loans. Secondly, I think loans are dependent on an economy's ability to recover insofar as you can get the money from your loans back, right? That only occurs on our side of the house because autocracies inherently have high investor confidence due to the stability within that area. Within a democracy, economic policies are constantly changing. You don't know what a governor or a leader is going to do because of the constantly changing political situation. Whereas on our side, it is far more predictable as to what dictators are going to do in terms of their economic policy. What that means then, it's far easier as an investor or the IMF, for example, giving out an emergency loan to determine whether you're going to get that money back. It means that loans are far more likely on our side. We're able to flip this argument. Their second argument is to say that, or third argument is to say that, the problem with dictators is that they're accountable to oligarchs in the army, and this is very corrupt. Two responses to this. Firstly, as we know, these actors have incentives for the economic recovery as well. Why is this true? They also want stability to preserve the current dictator because that dictator is pro-military and is pro-oligarch, right? The reason why their case doesn't make any sense is if you depose the dictator that is literally supporting you, well, then you wouldn't gain anything out of it. I think these oligarchs and military generals would do anything to prevent civil and political upheaval so that they are able to preserve the current leader so that they can preserve their current political power. And no, here's the trade-off, right? If you're an oligarch, there is a guaranteed chance that you'll remain powerful, that you'll remain wealthy if the current leader is in power. However, on their side of the house, there is no guarantee as to which other leader or political rival is going to come into power, which is much more uncertain for you. So that trade-off falls on our side of the house. Secondly, I would also note that like these rich oligarchs also have businesses, right? They also have investments within that economy. They likely also want stability. Like starting a political revolution, right, and like screwing over all your investments seems like a really terrible idea if you're a smart financial investor, right? So this like, you know, excuse to overthrow you line that we hear from LO is just completely ridiculous. These oligarchs, the military, they're already well off. They don't want more instability. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Look, these oligarchs don't have to change the entire political system to replace you. They can just, it's not that hard to find in an autocracy somebody else who is pro-oligarchy and pro-military, right? There's probably a bunch of people who are willing to be your puppet.
Okay, but then if, like, even if you can find someone else who's pro-oligarch and pro-military, well, then why wouldn't you just stay with the current guy who's also pro-oligarch and pro-military? Like, why would you go through all the political upheaval and all the instability to just get no result, right? I think that's a completely dumb POI. Also, they never responded to like any of our mechanisms about why like dictatorships are structurally better, right? We explained to you as to why we're able to mobilize resources in a way that democracies can't because of their limited power, right? Things like redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor, which is very likely insofar as dictators want to be able to, you know, get like even if dictators in the long term have incentives to support oligarchs, I think within this short-term realm of economic recovery, they're willing to do things like redistribute wealth in order to maintain their power and prevent political upheaval. So look at how in Kenya, they recently stopped the tax increase on food, for example, in order to prevent this. We think it's very likely that some dictators are willing to listen to their populace in order to prevent political revolution in the short term, but also things like reallocating oil from unnecessary consumer factories, right? You can't get any of that on their side of the house because the Supreme Court is going to call you unconstitutional, because you're going to be put in prison afterwards because you know that your political rivals are going after you. Secondly, in terms of like the facilitation of labor, I think it's also very similar, just like bailing out key businesses to maintain employment and productivity. None of that happens on their side of the house. So what is the ultimate weighing in this case? I think firstly, within the short term, you would much rather live in a stable area, right? I think we also hear a line from OO coming that like you might be put in like prison or something if you're living in this autocracy. I think during this short-term time of economic crisis, the dictator's priority is not to randomly put people into prison. The dictator's priority is to economically recover before focusing on other things like, you know, growing his power or wealth or whatever, right? I think so I think in that case, I think random political prisoners is incredibly unlikely. I also think that the instability of a democracy also shouldn't be underestimated, right? If you're living in a democracy and you're living in an economic crisis, literally everyone's just out there to fend for themselves, right? There's no toilet paper on the shelves or whatever, right? That's also hugely problematic for you. And as we already explained, physical utilitarian benefits are most proximate to you. Here's the ultimate weighing at the end of the day. Even if autocracies don't make perfect decisions, at least they're acting. On side opposition, there's a guaranteed chance of failure because democracies will do nothing to act at all. We protect millions from starvation and homelessness. That's why we're very proud to propose.
Thanks for this very fine speech. And now to open the second half of this debate, I call on the member of government. Here.
Okay, hopefully I am audible. Cool. All right. Yeah, I'll take a POI at some point, and I will choose a team to take it from. Oh, do them verbally. I'm shit at looking at the chat. Okay. I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Unsurprisingly, opening government managed to find the right headlines on a motion in which what the headlines were going to be was quite clear. What they didn't do, however, was mechanize them properly. We will provide that mechanization, and we will explain why that mechanization is round-winning, not just a fluffy addition that is unnecessary, and we're going to be OO in the process. Our metric for this debate ultimately is going to be the ability to recover from economic crises. I think the impacts of poverty during these crises should be relatively clear. Firstly, it is material suffering at the point at which you're less able to buy food, to put on the table, to be able to heat your home in winter. Secondly, it is psychological insecurity. Even if you are not yet suffering, even if you are not yet out on the street, there is always the possibility that that is something that can happen in future. There is a very good reason why for every rise of 1% in unemployment in the US, you see about 80,000 more deaths primarily of despair because of things like suicide and drug addiction. At that point then, I think this probably is almost certainly the most important metric. First thing, why do autocracies design better policy, or at least policy that is nearly as good as democratic governments? I would notice that opening government are a lot heavier on why they want to do this, not very heavy on why they actually are able to design this kind of good policy that is relevant given the criticism the opening opposition give that these governments are less accountable. But notably also, firstly, you need this analysis, otherwise acting faster is actively a bad thing. You do the bad policy faster. You need this analysis for you to be able to get investors' confidence. If investors are more sure of what an autocracy will do, but that policy is bad, then they are just more sure that you are doing a bad thing. Moreover, the solutions the opening government themselves propose are a little bit misaligned with their incentive analysis on why politicians would want to do this well. They talk about expropriating governments, forced labor. Not massively clear to me why these are really good solutions to economic crises, so this is something that's relevant to address. Look, here's the thing. Most solutions are relative to most crises are really relatively well understood by economists. If you have inflation in your economy, the solution is to do higher interest rates. If you have deflation, it is to lower them. If there is a lack of suspending and like structurally limited demand in your economy, the solution is government stimulus. If your borrowing costs are rising, you need to reduce the deficit by raising taxes and lowering spending. What does this imply? It implies that even if these governments are not perfect actors, it is very hard for them to get this massively wrong because it is really obvious what the solutions are. Given that we have analysis on why they want to do this kind of thing, this then suggests that they actually will. And in terms of why these things are understood, look, I think we have very large data sets of the common types of crises insofar as that those have happened frequently. There has also been massive amounts of academic attention that is very well funded, given how critical it is to the economy, devoted to trying to understand these kind of things. In the instances where the solutions are more complex and poorly understood, they won't get solvency either. But moreover, democratic politics doesn't have an incentive to provide the right solutions. It just has an incentive to provide the appearance of giving the right solutions. And the problem is that even though leaders and the sorts of economists they have incentives to hire understand them, the ordinary people don't, because these are complex issues that most people don't understand, because there are often short-term downsides to long-term good policies that mean that people think they are wrong even if they are not. Cutting welfare may sometimes be necessary to fund more welfare in the long run, but in the short term it looks like it's stupid. Raising interest rates when people are already struggling to pay their bills because of inflation is probably a long-term good idea, but it will also make people's mortgages and rents more expensive, which looks like a bad thing. Moreover, democratic politicians, in the instances in which they're not actually recovering well, can just blame other democratic politicians. They blame the independent central bank. They blame the other party forcing concessions into their bill that made that it couldn't be effective. They blame the other party for delaying. And I think often then, this can't happen in autocracies because there is no one else to blame, right? But notably, the other party as well may often actively sabotage your effort to recover from the economy because they don't want you to get credit for that. Notice how this undercuts opening opposition's mechanisms on how you can act decisively, why there are ways of acting decisively under a democratic government. We give reasons why you're not going to choose to act decisively, or why even if you do, that will be a bad thing. Second piece of substantive extension, why crises deepen dramatically for structural reasons if you do not address them quickly. Here is why this is important. Yes, opening governments say they're going to solve solutions faster. Opening opposition then do mitigation to say that they are able to solve them reasonably fast as well. If the difference is a matter of weeks or months in the negotiations for passing this bill, it is unclear to me from opening up government's analysis why that small time delay is worth sacrificing any of the benefits that the opposition care about. Here are three reasons why crises crises are structurally likely to worsen the longer you leave them incredibly quickly, such that we cannot afford taking the risk of waiting, even if it is only a couple weeks or months. Firstly, demand, and I'm going to talk about this in terms of types of economic crises, because this has not really been done before in this round anyway. Firstly, demand-based recessions. I think this looks like things where there's lack of spending because of things like unemployment. Look, when those are happening, people have less jobs and less income. When they recognize that their savings are being run down, they spend less, which means that unemployment goes up because other businesses are not able to receive income. So that sort of crisis tends to deepen very rapidly. Second, inflationary. Actually, before I run out of time, I will take CO, please, or OO, whoever has one.
Obviously, democracies have a much better starting off point when going into a crisis than than autocracies, which is why an economic crisis in the West looks like a couple of people losing their jobs, where in, I don't know, an autocracy, it looks like actual mass starvation. Like the characterization is obviously different.
I think there are plenty of failed democracies all around the world that are enormously poor. I think there are plenty of autocracies that are fairly rich. Second kind of crisis, inflationary and deflationary crises. Consumer expectations provide self-fulfilling cycles here. If you think that the currency is going to become if you think the goods are going to keep going and becoming more and more expensive, your incentive is to buy goods that you need now before they get more expensive. But that pushes up inflation. If you think that goods are going to get cheaper because you have deflation, as you do in places like China or Japan, your incentive is to save because then you can buy them cheaper. But this again perpetuates deflation because the demand for goods is going down. Third type of crises, financial contagion. Notably, banks and companies hold assets in other companies. When those original banks and companies are doing poorly, they sell assets in others to be able to regain capital. But that makes the companies that they had the assets in, like the shares and bonds or whatever, do worse. But they also, banks and companies, loan to other companies. At the point at which one bank that is making loans to others fails, the people that it was making loans to, the point at which one bank that was making loans to other fails, other people who had loaned money to that first bank now worry they're not going to get their money back. This is why it's urgent. This is why we cannot afford to waste time. Very, very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech. And now to bring in the last team into the debate, I call on the member of opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Great. Please put your POIs in the chat. I'll probably take one from, probably closing, but we'll see. All right. Analyzing the characterization of what these different countries, whether democratic or autocratic, look like going into a crisis has been like almost like negligible or not done at all, which is that they actually look very different. What we're telling you is democracies have a much better starting point and a much better preparedness when entering an economic crisis than autocracies, and that is particularly important. Secondly, the capacity for good policy to emerge is also much more likely because of higher educated populace, and the idea of freedom of speech, being able to scrutinize policy and government decisions, means better policy comes out of it. And thirdly, we're also going to talk a little bit about international actors. I know opening opposition touches upon this. I think we're going to do it better and do a more structured level. First, on the better starting off point. One, generally on aggregate, people in countries, people in and countries that are democracies are just more prosperous than autocracies. People have an average better jobs, higher GDP per capita, higher incomes. This is historically true, but also makes sense structurally, right? You have property rights that allow you to aggregate a reasonable amount of wealth for you. It incentivizes you more because you get to keep fruits of your labor. You also are historically likely a capitalist country, have a more globalized economy because that facilitates international trade, etc. You're likely to be a more tertiary economy as opposed to one that focuses on things that are very prone to these economic shocks. But secondly, democracies are also generally have guardrails in place that make sure that when an economic crisis comes, you're more prepared, right? It makes legislation that makes banks and large institutions prepare for crisis, have cash pillows, insurance, etc. Legislation that also also prioritize and protect individuals and their money. Like even if a bank fails, government ensures that until a certain amount of money, you're still able to access it. You have oil reserve, gas reserves, right? Why? Because people are able in beforehand to call out if you're unprepared. We have also like crises have happened in the past. This is true, but the only way that you are able to learn from it is if there's democratic institutions in place that force political leaders to do these kind of things, which is why I think on aggregate democracies are better prepared for crisis. That means even if opening government is right and autocracies are better at delivering drastic policies, there's a less need for drastic policies in democracies because they're better prepared, which is why economic crises in democracies don't look like mass starvation and people actually dying. They look like in 2008, which was horrible for a lot of people when the housing bubble burst, but people weren't dying en masse. Yes, they didn't have jobs, and yes, it was hard, but people were still able to live. I think the opposite is true for autocracies. One, they're generally poorer, which is historically true. Autocracies are often the outcome of civil war, post-colonial struggles. The economy before a crisis was already barely providing for people, and people were living paycheck to paycheck, right?
Yeah.
But secondly, there were also less guardrails and preparations for it. Why? Because in public pressure, like forcing you to enact legislation just didn't exist. Secondly, there were no public institutions calling out beforehand the lack of preparedness, right? Which is why in autocracies, economic crises do look like mass starvation and people being unprepared. Why? Because they haven't had the economic wealth to prepare individually and institutionally. But secondly, there's also a higher capacity for good policies to be implemented in democracies as opposed to autocracies. Why? In democracies, you have a higher educated population. There's more expertise in the people. Why? Because democratically, they could call for easier access to education. But secondly, there is also more ability to publicly scrutinize bad policy. One, on a public level, i.e. think tanks, experts that have freedom of speech and can call out bad policy in public. But also structures exist that enable scrutiny, i.e. there's checks and balances to make sure that you don't just do anything. No, it enables you to voice dissent also in institutions, i.e. in democracies, when you're part of the finance ministry, you will not lose your job if in the Ministry of Finance, when a meeting happens, you say, oh, the current policy that is being implemented, the data just shows it is not the way to go, right? I think that means just on aggregate, better policies come out of democracies and democratic institutions and bodies than autocracies. I think the opposite is true for autocracies. Why? A, fewer people have access to higher education. It means you already have a smaller pool of people to be able to pull from that are even have the like intellectual and educational background to be able to help you in economic crisis. But secondly, those that do have education often try and get out of autocracies, right? Which is why you have brain drain. When they go over for a semester, they don't come back. That's why like people were fleeing from Eastern Germany to Western Germany, because at the point where you are educated, you do aspire for things like civil liberties, because you do have the time and energy to think of, hey, maybe freedom of speech would be nice. That means there's a huge plea of experts that could help you out of your autocracy into a democracy. But secondly, who advises the autocratic leader, right? These are people who know if I dissent and disagree with this like godlike figure that is the leader, these are yes men and sycophants that are afraid to say, hey, the public policy that we're currently implementing is failing, because they know, oh, this could mean that I don't know, end up in a Siberian labor camp or something of the sort, right? Because they know they're being penalized in oftentimes a physical way, not just an economical way for when they are not doing their job. That means they're also less likely to report how bad circumstances actually are, which hinder and are a huge roadblock in autocracy's capacity to actually do good policy. Lastly, on international actors, I want to flag, I know OO says international actors and the IMF gives money to. I think there is heavily underanalyzed. They just basically say, oh, because they perceive you to be a democracy, they're nice to you and want to give out loans. But I think the difference is actually that democratic institutions give the safety to international actors that they are willing to give you money and other expertise in the first place. It is the idea that, oh, an independent judiciary exists that makes sure this money isn't being spent in a completely ludicrous and outrageous way. It is the idea that there are checks and balances in place that ensure that the money is being spent in a good way and that international deals are being upheld. The same safety and the safety and stability that this institutional like separation gives doesn't exist on government side. Before I continue, OG.
All of your analysis relies on a perfect democracy utopia. There are countless poor post-colonial democracies overrun by corruption that also suffer from brain drain and similar issues.
I think this is true. I think on aggregate, it's still more likely that it's better on our side of the house. But even these like not perfect democracies, the democracies that are flawed democracies, are comparatively better off than these autocracies. Why? Because one, international actors and these judiciaries have a comparatively higher degree of faith in them. But secondly, the ability for like other and outside people to come in and for people within the government to be able to voice dissent and ensure like all the safety and guardrails is still comparatively higher. That means the capacity for good solutions to come out of there is still far, far greater on our side of the house than on your side of the house. And I think these things, one, crisis preparedness, B, capacity for policy, and thirdly, like institutional stability, which provide international actors of security, is Nguyen's closing opposition debate. For all these reasons, proud to be on CO.
I thank the speaker very much for this very fine speech, and now to close the case for said government, I call on the government whip. Here.
Am I audible and visible? Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Closing opposition's argument is just empirically false, but also strategically something that shouldn't be giving them any place in this debate. The reason why it is strategically a bad call to do this argumentation is because this motion is about an economic crisis has already happened, which is to say, if you're already able to deal with it in some way or the other, probably this motion doesn't really, like, this is probably not the motion, which is to say there has to be some crisis there to begin with. Then you're probably going to debate on comparatively when there is a, basic similar level of ground in which kind of the world you get better sort of advantage, whether or not it's the autocratic country or whether or not it's the democratic country. This is the first framing. But the second response is just empirically false, right? Like there are so many countries that are autocratic that has the kind of like development that are necessary. Like for example, China, Vietnam, Rwanda, Russia, all of these countries have developed a lot despite the fact that they are very autocratic. On comparison, there are countries that are like just simply democratic, but has like probably doesn't have the characteristic that they talk about, like isn't that educated. For example, like India, Bosnia, or like a lot of East European countries, or like Bangladesh and so on and so forth. All of these countries probably doesn't have the characteristics or attributes that they talk about. There are some democracies that probably are capable, probably have the kind of things that they are talking about, and so there are autocratic countries. So this is just not like in debate lingo is not something that is contentious to the debate or itself. It's not, it's just out of the frame to begin with. So the main argument that they try to push from their side of the house is just irrelevant to begin with. But I'm still going to respond to this. That the second idea is just why autocratic countries are likely to have the kind of infrastructure that is going to have them, like going to have equipped them to deal with this. First of all, like they are probably likely to like focus on things like infrastructure and so on and so forth, which just generally means that they have the kind of things that can generate more wealth. For example, bridges or so on and so forth, which can essentially boost growth at a time when you don't have like, you know, businesses growing up and so on and so forth, because you are more able to extract tax and so on and so forth, which is just much more better. But secondarily, this is probably the only thing you offer to the country, which means you're always afraid that you're going to get kicked out, which is one of the reasons why autocratic countries, autocratic governments always have the incentive to continue developing, because they are afraid that the point in time they are going to show that they're going to have big losses is going to result in them getting kicked out, because at the very end of the day, even though they don't have like direct accountability, they still fear some level of backlash is going to happen, and for that reason they probably don't want to have that kind of things at the first place. So that argument is done. Second, in terms of capacity, I think this is kind of interesting. The only analysis that they give, oh, people are more likely to be more educated. This just directly does not like, you know, like think about any of the argument we made under our side of the world. We gave you ample of reasons as to why there is more incentive for autocratic government to be more capable and have the do the kind of things in a faster way. They don't respond to as to why faster decision is more and more important. They give you absolutely no responses. But secondarily, in terms of capacity, I want to note this: most of the people who become ministers in foreign, like, you know, like in economic, like in finance ministry and so on and so forth are likely to be people who are likely to be advocated or like pushed by different sort of lobbying group. For example, like I don't know, business groups and so on and so forth. Because if they're going to be unpopular, they're not going to get any sort of political campaign funding and so on and so forth. So this means that the kind of people that you bring into power has to answer to different big lobbying groups. And furthermore and more crucially, these are also particularly ministers who probably wants to come off as more more popular and so on and so forth. And I want to use O's analysis here. At the time when there is an economic crisis, you probably want to make sure that people are being able to spend money and so on and so forth. And I'm going to flip this furthermore when I'm going to respond to their loan argument. But note that when you have to make sure that you have to ensure that people are able to spend more money and people actually vote you in, you have to focus on the short-term goal, because your election is probably going to happen in 1 year. So you try to prolong whatever it is happening in as much as possible. You try to loan out all of the banks that you know are probably going to fail anyway, because you want to keep being in power for whatever short period of time you can be in power. That is the kind of incentive that only you have, for which reason you take decisions far later, which just makes our argument even more stronger, because we first of all tell you the kind of people that you put in power, because of the fact that you have the kind of incentive, you only want to put the best of the best to those particular positions, like people who are meritocratic, people who are probably economists themselves, because you don't have to care about them being popular in elections and so on and so forth. But secondarily and more crucially, you have then the incentive to take decisions faster, because you are thinking in long term, and this further exaggerates the arguments about like the short-term decision and long-term decision, the time bomb argument that my members talks about a lot more, which means that we win on that metric as well. Lastly, before I go to the loan argument, I would like to take opening actually.
Politicians live in these countries. They can't spin 20% unemployment or other significant statistics. If politicians hate, why do economic crises ever get solved in democracies if politicians are so inefficient?
Yeah, that's why we're arguing, right? It's like autocratic half, that was your burden, and the only solvency that came from O was just, you get loans. Now all I have to prove is that why getting the loans is probably a worse idea, right? And now coming to the idea of loans and so on and so forth, and this is very important. Opening opposition, the only solvency they give, and sort of like closing opposition as well, the derivative argument that they try to run, which is just that you get some level of solvency under their side of the world, just solely because of the fact that you have the loans that you can sort of take on, and then you can just use this in order to get out of the problems and so on and so forth. The problem is that it is always going to be your fallback option, which is, you always know you can probably move to IMF and so on and so forth, which is the reason why you can prolong this as long as you want to, because you know there is some level of fallback option. And when the recession gets to its worst possible manner, you then take the loan because there is no way out. On contrary, autocrats probably have less options to take loans from, and thus they have the bigger sort of motivation to solve the crisis is far better because of the reasons we explained. But furthermore, oligarchs probably care about solving these issues much more as well, because of the fact that they care about the currency, the fact that their currency doesn't get any worse, and because they have to then won't be able to convert this to dollar or so on and so forth, for their export and all of those things be hard. For all this reason, proud to.
I thank the speaker very much for this very nice speech, and now to close the debate as a whole, I call on the opposition whip. Hecke.
Okay, lovely. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, firstly, placing the extension in case I forget about the weighing later. What is the metric by which you should judge this debate? I think the entire debate is for once very much in agreement that we all believe that fulfilling basic human rights and creating the best quality of life for people in the country is the things that we should judge this by. We agree with it. So if our metric is fulfilling human needs and general quality of life, we need to prioritize democracies, because democracies from the get-go tend to have better healthcare, better education, better infrastructure. They have more institutionalized knowledge knowledge that helps them to deal with economic crises long term, because those institutions are allowed to exist over longer periods of time. Whereas in autocracies, they usually get overhauled really quickly or are simply not listened to unless they say the things that the autocrat wants to hear. You have more accountability in terms of elections and institutions that protect the democracy, but you also have more accountability in terms of public press that can like analyze the things that the government is doing and then explain why that might be a good thing or a bad thing. And you have better expertise, as Victor explains to you, because you don't have exclusively sycophants, but actual experts who are willing to work with the government. And you have less brain drain, meaning that you have smarter people and more educated people stay within the country. So that gives us at the end a better starting point, but more crucially, it gives us the capacity to respond to those crises, which is why it's not as urgent, but it gives us a better capacity to respond to them, because we are able to set better policies for that. So even if our policies come about a little slower, but I'm going to talk about that in a second, even if they come about a little slower, there's still going to be better policies. Whereas the best thing that both gov teams can prove is that you're going to have faster decisions, but they cannot prove to us why they're on average going to be better decisions. Okay, now let's talk about a lot of the things that we heard from both opposition teams. So let's quickly deal with the point about loans, because it was the last thing that I heard from CG. So A, you concede that it is easier for democracies to get loans by your own metric, but also by Fraser's very own analysis, cash injections and putting money into the economy is the solution to at least 2 of the 3 economic problems he mentioned. So I don't think that governments are going to like throw themselves into getting loans every single time that they need to. But at the point where we actually are in a crisis, getting access to money quickly is crucial. And at the point where it's proven that democracies are able to do that better, I think we have already proven better capacity to deal with an economic crisis. Then they tell us that there's loads of that there's tons of flawed democracies. Okay, let's be realistic. Yes, there are flawed democracies that are not doing as economically well. But on the flip side, you have a few non-flawed autocracies that are doing comparatively economically well. On average, autocracies are much worse off economically because either they have natural resources that might drive up GDP, but that GDP never reaches the general population, but it only like extends to, like the upper class. So even if GDP is high in some autocracies, that doesn't mean that it translates into good quality of life. We also give structured reasons why that is the case. We don't just say that, oh, statistically that is true, but Victor explains to you strategically why, like due to things like property rights, due to things like accountability, due to things like, like better education and actually having to use human capitals, because most democracies do not rely on, for example, natural resources, but on a working population. Those countries tend to be better off. Okay, now let's deal with what we heard from CG. This actually goes into the first thing that I want to talk about when talking about CG, which is the thing that they tell us that, let's start with Fraser's speech. Okay, so they tell us why autocracies are good at designing good policy. And I'm confused with the point here, because they tell us that the solution is incredibly obvious and everyone who knows like even the littlest bit of economy know that. Please explain to me why in a democracy, which on average has better education level, which on average has people who are better, like suited for that job in those institutions of power, why those people are less likely to make the decision. It is so incredibly clear to everyone when you have expert influence and accountability. I think at that point, it boils down to whether the government feels responsible for the people that is governing or not. That happens much more likely on government side, whereas on autonomy side, on autocracy side, you have little accountability. You have more risk for human error because the pool of people making decisions are smaller, and you just very often have megalomaniacs in place who will not listen to fucking anybody. So you also often have a massive disconnect from the people because you live kind of like in your golden castle and don't really see how the average person is living, meaning you also do not feel responsible for them. Then they tell us a bunch of economic terms, and I get that economic things exist, but I don't really expect that they prove to us why that either proves urgency or why autocracies will handle that better, so I will not respond to that. Then they tell us that autocratic regimes have a big incentive to develop because only that is something they can provide. But note, as I've already mentioned, lots of autocracies don't rely on human capital. Most autocracies statistically rely on natural resources that puts those people into power because it makes them the wealthiest. So they have very little incentive to actually invest into their own population. They actually profit from keeping education levels or ability to leave the country or the ability and time to be politically active lower, which means that they're actually quite happy about the countries not being as rich as they could be. Okay, now, another reason why we get better. Another reason was let me sort through my sheets. Okay, so Let's talk about things that we heard from OG, even though I think that they're broadly that we heard about broadly very similar. So OG, I think, has a massive flaw in their case where they explain to us that even if you get fast decisions, you do not explain to us why you get better decisions. I think this explains to both government sides. We explain to you why not only are democracies better set up from the get-go, but also why they have more capacity to listen to the people who are actively in charge, meaning that those good decisions that already exist are much more likely to exist on our side of the house. Now, let's go into way. Oh fuck! Sorry, I'm so sorry. I forgot about the POI. Okay, so let's go into way. Starting with OO. I think OO gives us a bunch of good things. OO tells us why autocracies often rely on other actors, why they have less international financial aid. But I think Victor explains to you in more detail why you're more likely to get that on our side of the house and why they can create fake economic change. But I don't think what they don't prove is why they're more structurally likely to actively make worse decisions. Victor explained that to you when he explains to you that usually advisors are sycophants that don't really tell people what to do when there's no accountability and when there's massive brain drain that gets people to leave the country, meaning that you don't have a lot of people that can actually provide good theme. I think the best case is that disaster. But I don't think that they weigh that up properly against the loss of human rights that you have on our side of the house, nor against the fact that democracies are going to be set up for these crises better from the very get-go. They also do not explain to us why those decisions are actually going to be good ones. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker very much.